Well, howdy. Good evening. Welcome back. It's time again. It's time again. So last time we left off, tonight we're continuing with Feasted Night. We left off last time on finishing up chapter 4, beginning chapter 5. These chapters are a little shorter than I would have imagined, so we might get a little bit further into it. Maybe one less stream than there was last time, and let's see how much I can get through tonight. If we finish it tonight, we finish it tonight. I have gotten into a new fantasy book, so I think we're going to switch to fantasy for this weekend. That being either Orconomics by J. Zachary Pike or The Apprentice by Turan Matharu, part of the Summoner series, a good friend of mine's favorite book series. And I've started reading the first few chapters of the first book, and I'm enjoying it. I find myself reading it in my spare time, so that'll be our little weekend project, and then next week we're back to whatever I feel like reading. I did recently pick up Krampus by Braum, and I'm so thoroughly excited about it. I'm so fucking excited. You can only get a physical copy. They don't really have online. I tried to get Kindle, and it didn't have online Kindle copies, but it had the. I got it, and it has those those frayed edges, the like rough edges and longer pages to make it look more like rustic. It's got that shit on it. It's really nice. I'm really happy about it. But let's see how far we get tonight. I just labeled this part 2. I don't know how many chapters I plan to read. We'll just see how many we get through. Hi, Moon. We'll see how many we get through. But yeah. And we begin. Chapter 5. What happened to your trousers? Asked the widow. Oh, let me switch to my... Whoa, you can see my... Don't look at my stuff. We begin at chapter 5. What happened to your trousers? Asked the widow, as I slunk through the door with my mud-spattered finery. I fought a boar, I told her, single-handed. You were right, it laughed at the rifle, so I was forced to wrestle it in the mud. I know, lord, said the widow to the ceiling, that you don't think much of liars. Thou shalt not bear false witness, you said, and fell in the mud, I said, sighing. I could save either my gun or my trousers, and my gun seemed more important. This provoked a loud sniff, but she couldn't really argue with this decision. Trousers, after all, could be laundered. Try running a rifle through the mangle. I suppose you'll be wanting me to wash them for you. I would be most profoundly grateful, Miss Botazatu. She took off her apron and picked up the buckets by the door. Just let me fetch some water from the stream, and I'll see if you've ruined them completely. The stream? I blinked at her. You don't use the spring house? I don't care for it, she snapped. But it's right by the back door. I said I don't care for it. I am perhaps not the sharpest bayonet on the battlefield, but even I know that if someone chooses to lug buckets of water 100 yards rather than 50 feet, there's a stronger reason than a passing fancy. While I might be miffed that we'd done all that work scrubbing the spring house out for nothing, what was I gonna do? Yell at her? Anyway, never argue with your laundress. She has the subtle and terrible ways of taking her revenge. I had, fortunately, changed into clean trousers when I heard a "Halloo" from the stable yard and came running down the steps, all thoughts of the spring house and water preferences forgotten. A coach was just leaving as I opened the door, and Angus was handing off his horse to Bors. Our visitor stood amid a modest pile of trunks and baggage. Eugenia Potter looked just as she had when I saw her last, a sturdy, gray-haired Englishwoman, wearing very sensible waterproof boots. She inclined her head and gave me a small smile, which the English upper class was the equivalent of flinging her arms around my neck and pounding me in the back. Lieutenant? Miss Potter, I bowed. To my mild puzzlement, she pulled out a small book, peered at it, and nodded once. Then she said in an accented but quite clear Galatian, Easton, you young sinner, the devil hasn't taken you yet, I see. My jaw sagged open. Boris, who was still in the stable yard, let out a single braying laugh and immediately slapped his hand over his mouth. Angus put his hand over his eyes. Oh dear, said Miss Potter, taking note of my expression. Is my accent that bad? She brandished the book at me. Oh, excuse me. Is my accent that bad? No, I said, picking my chin up off my chest, but who taught you to say that? She brandished the book at me. This is the only Galatian phrasebook I've been able to locate. It described that as, let me see, a warm greeting suitable between two friends of equal social status. I have been telling Eugenia that the phrasebook may not be entirely accurate, said Angus. Well, I suppose it wasn't wrong, exactly. I shook my head. I wouldn't use that one, Miss Potter. It's, I floundered for a phrase. The sort of thing you'd say to a fellow drinker at a pub, say. Miss Potter was clearly appalled by this, but rallied. I do beg your pardon, Lieutenant. Not at all, not at all. I'm delighted that we could provide you an opportunity to see the natural beauty of Gallacia. Especially the mushrooms, said Angus. I twitched. Oh, yes! Her face grew suddenly animated. So many! I've been told there are even Boletus regius found in here, which are so dreadfully rare in Europe now. Are there? I asked weakly, wondering what nightmarish fungus that might be. Certainly. Our firwood is just what it loves. I would dearly love to paint one. She rubbed her hands together. And if there are any sheep meadows about, preferably very old ones, I am hopeful to find earth tongues. The peak season will be coming on soon, and of course you can barely find them in England any longer. Earth tongues, I repeated. While I had not forgotten just how single-minded Miss Potter could be on the subject of mushrooms, I admit that the time had softened my memory somewhat. There are certainly sheep meadows about, lots of them. Wonderful. If I can find a good specimen of the slimy earth tongue, I shall be most pleased. I'm sure that can be arranged, Angus said with a light in his eyes that indicated he would scour the countryside until he had laid a slimy earth tongue at Miss Potter's feet. Boris began carrying her trunks inside. I grabbed a suitcase and gestured to the door. May I show you to your room? Yes, thank you. She paused, gazing up at the lodge. What a charming building. Small, but it does for us, said Angus gruffly, but I could tell he was pleased. I hope you'll be comfortable here, I said. I'm certain I shall be. Truly, I should be grateful in far rougher surroundings if it meant that I could spend time scouring your woodland for fungus. Why, in a forest like this, there could be as many as... I held up a hand. Miss Potter, I said, with as much grace as I could muster. You know that I am your devoted servant. I would travel to the farthest reaches of the globe if you asked. Your enemies are my enemies. I would fall upon my sword if I thought I had contributed in the slightest to your unhappiness. Miss Potter regarded me with knife-sharp eyes and said dryly, I sense a butt coming, Lieutenant. Please, I beg of you, don't tell me that there is fungus all around us. Do not remind me about spores in the water or mushroom bits in the air. I cannot bear it. If you absolutely must tell me an exciting mushroom, please start by telling me that it cannot possibly infect me or grow over me or poison me or, well, you know. Her lips twitched. The vast majority can do no such thing, I assure you. I shook my head. It wasn't that I disbelieved her. Eugenia Potter was a true scientist regardless of what the fossils at the Royal Mycology Society believed. And she learned more about fungus before breakfast than most of us would learn in a lifetime. Still, they truly don't bother you, I asked, even after... I didn't finish my sentence, but I knew that I didn't need to. Mycology is my life's work, said Miss Potter simply. If a veterinarian dealt with a rabid wolf, no one would expect him to fear all animals afterwards. So yes, even after. She flapped a hand in the direction of the door and, presumably, Moravia and the dark tarn that had consumed the Usher house. I sighed. Perhaps it was easier when you were a mycologist and saw the whole thing in shades of fungi, but could easily differentiate between those and what went into an omelet, but possibly it was just the mycologist in question. You are a braver soul than I am, Miss Potter. She raised an eyebrow. How many medals do you have in a box somewhere, Lieutenant? Too many. They mostly don't hand those out for being brave, just for being too foolish to run away. She pursed her lips and looked ready to argue, but I headed off with a peace offering. All that said, there's a mushroom in the spring house. I don't know what it is, but I saved it for you when we cleaned it out. Come now, said Angus. Miss Potter hasn't even unpacked. Don't go making work for her already. No. Miss Potter gave him a much warmer smile over her shoulder than I had ever seen her give to anything that didn't have spores. I'd rather look at it while the light is good. Unpacking is boring and easily done after dark. We all tromped out to the spring house. Even in the afternoon light, the interior was dark. But Miss Potter needed only a quick look. Ah, a fine Mycena species. Amazing that you can tell all that at a glance, said Angus. Ah, said Miss Potter. But this one at least is something any amateur could recognize. She reached down and plucked one of the small mushrooms up, carrying it to the light. Observe, if you please. We gathered around her, Angus besotted, me dubious, and Boris probably just wondering what we were blathering about. Miss Potter removed a pin from her hat and gouged the mushroom in its nasty pinkish cap. It immediately began to bleed. Gah! I said, taking a step back as the cap oozed a dark syrupy red down her fingers. The common name is bleeding bonnets, Miss Potter said. This looks rather like the Mycena hemapatus. Or excuse me. Ooh, good. Mycena hematopus. Although those are more usually found in rotting wood. She held it up, turning it this way and that. A sanguinolenta would be more usual given the location. Though of course that would not grow nearly so large. She nodded to me. An interesting specimen. I shall take a spore print. Boris had been following this with interest, granted that he did not speak the language, and finally spoke up to say, Is that not a bloodfoot mushroom? Is that what it's called here? I asked weakly. He nodded. We do not eat them. They grow where the familiar sits. Angus translated this from Miss Potter. Like a witch's familiar, he means. That better not be any familiar sitting around in my spring house, I grumbled. Angus snorted, but Boris gave me another grave nod. If you bury a cat there, it would keep spirits away. Nobody is burying a cat. I like cats. Not a living cat. Boris was appalled that I would think he was perpetuating violence on innocent felines. But perhaps there will be a cat in the village who has already died. I said, purchase it. I rubbed my forehead. It's just a mushroom, Boris. We don't need to go buying deceased cats. Boris actually looked disappointed, as if going to purchase a dead cat was a rare treat. Angus glanced over his shoulder at me and raised his eyebrows. I muttered something rude and followed him inside to dinner. Miss Potter and Widow Batazatu did not share a common language, but somehow they managed to communicate. Miss Potter's phrasebook Galatian, vetted by Angus, was suitable for please and thank you and may I help, which were enough to endear her to the widow. I tried not to resent this. I said all those things too, but the widow was never going to overlook my sin of being her employer. Miss Potter, being foreign, was shunted in the same category as children and innocents, and thus her virtues were greatly magnified and her failures easily overlooked. I was simply a bad Galatian. It probably helped that Miss Potter did not demand English cooking and ate heartily of all the widow's dishes, passing praise via Angus or myself. The quality of our food improved markedly. It had not been bad before, but it had been fairly monotonous. Now we only had paprika sausage for every third meal. We stole that from the Hungarians back when we tried to fight them and they beat us senseless. This is how Gallacia acquired most of its cuisine. The widow made excellent paprika sausage, but one's bowels do require a few hours to recover now and again. Unfortunately, being suddenly held to higher standards did have its drawbacks. You'll be going to church tomorrow, of course, the widow informed me, cornering me in my bedroom. I had been thinking of taking a nap, but she began cleaning aggressively around me. Tomorrow. She skewered me with a look like a bayonet. It's Sunday, isn't it? I had no idea if it was Sunday. Days at the lodge had all blurred together. Oh, right. Sunday. The widow picked up my brush, untangled a few stray hairs from it, looked around for someone to dispose of them, and then clucked her tongue. Unlike some young wastrels I could name, she said to the ceiling, tucking them away in her apron. Miss Potter is a decent, God-fearing woman, and will doubtless wish to attend for her immortal soul. Oh, probably? Now, for the most part, I do not object to church. I think it's fine for those who want it. God, in my experience, is more likely to be found in gutters and at the bottom of dirty trenches than in designated architecture, but possibly that's just because that's where Ha is needed. Ha and Har are particular Galatian pronouns that are used only for God. When I found that in English those are sounds associated with laughter, all I could think was, yep, sounds about right. Nevertheless, I do not believe that God cares where you worship Har. The prayers of the dying on the mud of the battlefield and the pleas of the fearful hiding in cellars must surely ascend just as quickly as those uttered under the light of stained glass. More quickly if there is justice in the universe. There was also the tiny matter that Miss Potter was probably Church of England Gallacia's Catholic-ish. I opened my mouth to explain all this to the widow, but what came out was, "I'll go and ask." She folded her arms and glared, and I retreated with all speed. To my moderate dismay, Miss Potter announced that she would be delighted to attend services at a Galatian church. "It'll be in Latin," I warned her. "I know a fair amount of Latin, Lieutenant. I shall not take communion, for that would be theologically complicated, but I do not believe that God will object to me attending." I heaved a sigh and resigned myself to getting up early for the liturgy. Because Wolfseer was a good 2 miles away, we did indeed rise early. Boris had borrowed a donkey and cart from somewhere, and a donkey cart from somewhere, and a donkey to go with it. He must have gotten up before dawn to fetch it. Both Miss Potter and the widow rode with him, while Angus and I traveled like outriders, watching for bandits. We don't have that many bandits this far out of the capital. No one has enough to steal, and everyone knows one another, so if you did ride up, pull a pistol out and shout, "Stand and deliver," you'd most likely get a smack on the ear, a dire warning to tell your mother. Many a prospective bandit's career has been blighted by sheer embarrassment. There was a great deal of whispering and head-turning when we entered the church. Most of it was probably for Miss Potter, since being foreign is much more interesting than merely being an absentee landlord, but I still didn't enjoy it. I've never liked having large groups of people stare expectantly at me. It reminds me too much of my early days as an officer, back when I still thought that rank and file expected officers to make sense. I later learned that sergeants will handily translate anything you babble, but at the time it was terrifying. I would have preferred to sit in the back of the church and bolt as soon as the service ended, but the widow had other plans. She had brought both the foreigner and the prodigal wastrel to church, and by God, she was going to make sure everyone saw. She herded us all to the second pew from the front and made certain that we genuflected properly on the way in. The priest came out, greeted us all, and then launched into a great deal of Latin. Then a sermon, which went in one ear and out the other. I believe it may have been about Maccabees. Then there was a great deal more in Latin. My tinnitus kicked in about halfway through, but it didn't change anything much. I knelt when everyone else did, mumbled the responses, and tried to redeem myself by assisting the widow in rising afterward. We found ourselves in the line to speak to the priest after Mass. I saw that Miss Potter had her Galatian phrasebook in hand and winced in anticipation. "Remember that priests are addressed as Va and Var," I murmured in her ear. She frowned down at the phrasebook, then showed me a passage. "Is this an acceptable greeting?" It roughly translated to, "What trash has the wind blown in, then?" I shuddered and pointed to the next line down. Miss Potter mouthed it to herself, then nodded. Fortunately, she remembered the Va, and even more fortunately, Father Sebastian turned out to be fluent in German, as was Miss Potter. Va listened to her halting greeting, replied politely, and then switched, which took the burden of translation off me and, more importantly, the phrasebook. Father Sebastian was tall, all squares and rectangles, square beard, square shoulders, square and extremely thick eyebrows. "Forgive me," Miss Potter said to Va. "I am attempting to learn Galatian, but this phrasebook I have found has proved unreliable." Va grinned at that. "We do not publish so many books in our native tongue," Va said. "I have long wished to change that, but what with one thing and another." Va spread our hands. "The church sends me on rotation through 4 villages a month at each one, and there is so little time for the writing of books. But it is a delight to practice my German again." "But surely you must come and dine with us, Father," said Miss Potter, glancing at me to see if that was acceptable. I nodded affably. I have no objection to having a priest to dinner, so long as Va does not attempt to turn the blessing into a lengthy sermon. "Then you may practice your German, and I may try out my poor Galatian on you." "I would be most delighted," Father Sebastian said. Va considered briefly. "Would Tuesday be acceptable?" "Allow me to speak to the most important person involved," I said. The widow Batazatu, who had been observing this conversation between the priest and her pet foreigner with poorly hidden glee, was delighted at the prospect of feeding both at once and readily agreed. We parted from Father Sebastian with a promise to see Va in 2 days and, We're finally allowed to leave the church and return to our usual week's degeneracy. And that's chapter 5. I've never shipped anything so hard. Yeah. I want them together so bad. I want them to... Angus deserves Miss Potter, and Miss Potter deserves Angus, and that's the way it is. They're gonna get married at the end of this book. Or the next. Fuck, they're getting married at some point. Now, chapter 6. Tuesday rolled around, and the widow went into a flurry of cooking, as if expecting the priest to arrive with the entire royal family in tow. Father Sebastian brought only of ourselves, which was good for dinner conversation, but meant that we had food piled to the metaphorical rafters. After dinner, we broke into wine and, more importantly, the liverit. Miss Potter had never experienced liverit, and if we were good people, we would have allowed her to remain in that state of grace. She sniffed her glass, held it at arm's length, and said, "In England, after dinner, traditionally, the ladies retire to another room while the men drink. I've never approved of the tradition, but I am beginning to reconsider." You don't need to drink that," said Angus. "I'm sure there's more wine." "Angus," she said, "I am a scientist, and what is science without bold experimentation?" And she tossed back about half the glass and set it down, with a light in her eyes and her lips firmly pressed together over a cough. As difficult as it is to read Angus's emotions, I'm fairly certain that he lost the remainder of his heart to Miss Potter in that instant. Father Sebastian and I let out a cheer. I offered to refill her glass, but she set her hand over it and shook her head. "It was an experience," she said, only a little breathless. "I do not find myself needing to replicate that experiment, however." Father Sebastian laughed. "You are an honorary Galatian now," Vaught told her. "Good God, Father, why would you lay such a curse on her?" I made a sign to avert the evil eye and heard the widow snort audibly from the kitchen. "I see that you have employed the widow Bautizatu," said Father Sebastian an hour or two later, once the widow had informed us that we could clean up after ourselves because she was going to bed. "Oh yes," I said, topping up our wine. "She's been taking excellent care of us." "A most charming woman," Va said, proving that even men of the cloth will lie when it suits them. "She's been a stalwart member of the parish for as long as I have served here." "She's a fine cook as well," said Miss Potter. "I've not been fed so well in a long time." I was at the pleasant stage of inebriation where I felt nothing but goodwill toward my fellow creatures. Still, it took a moment to think of something nice to say about the widow. I stared at the stuffed boar for inspiration. "She's very brave." All eyes turned toward me, and I realized that I was going to have to explain. Angus couldn't get anyone else to work here, all afraid of a... what was it? Moroi, if you can believe it. But not our Bautizatu. "Moroi?" asked Miss Potter. "What's that?" "A monster that sits on your chest," I explained. Miss Potter's head tilted to one side like a very intelligent dog that had just watched you do something inexplicably foolish. "I beg your pardon." I shrugged helplessly, having exhausted my meager store of information about Moroi. It was probably time I switched to water. "Sorry, I didn't hear the right stories growing up. Father Sebastian, do you know?" "I've heard of them, of course." Bob gave me an apologetic glance. I had even heard rumors that there was one, at large. Obviously, I tried to dampen them, but there is only so much that one can do. "Is this a local superstition?" asked Miss Potter. "Not just local. You can find variations all across this part of Europe. The mare, the mara, the moroi. She has a very wide range." Boss steepled our fingers. "A demon that comes in while you sleep crouches atop your chest, stealing the breath from your lungs." "Like an alb," said Miss Potter. "Yes, much like that. Though the moroi, she is always female. She is often supposed to be like a werewolf, too, in that sometimes she's a living person who goes out about at night." Miss Potter shook her head slightly. "In my time in Moravia, where I met my hosts here, I heard stories of werewolves, but it did not seem as if they truly believed in them. This was far from the worst thing she encountered in Moravia, but I did not want to sour the wine in my stomach by thinking about it. I wonder if she ever tried to tell anyone about the Tarn. Would anyone believe it?" "Gallacia is still steeped in the old ways," said Father Sebastian. "Very steeped. Do you know how Wolf's Ear got its name?" Va addressed that last question toward me, and I had to admit that I didn't. Ah. Story goes that there was a town with a different name long ago that was plagued by a werewolf. One night, a man was walking home and was set upon by a wolf. He fought back and managed to cut its ear off. In the morning, the mayor was missing an ear. He tried to hide it, but the man nailed the wolf's ear to the door of the church, and by that everyone knew that the mayor was a werewolf. Or he was simply very unlucky and lost an ear at exactly the wrong time, I muttered. Ah. The priest's lips twisted ruefully. They thought of that. We are practical people, are we not? They cut off his other ear first, and it too became the ear of a wolf. And so they drove him from the village with stones. Miss Potter put a napkin to her lips. Father Sebastian was immediately contrite. Forgive me, Miss Potter, for discussing such things in gentle company. No, not at all, she shook her head. It was I who asked about werewolves. So does the Moroi turn into a wolf as well? Into a moth, if the stories are to be believed. Father Sebastian leaned back in our chair. Bit harder to cut the ear off a moth, observed Angus dispassionately. Indeed, and easier for the moth to slip into houses unobserved. I imagine most people would notice if a wolf was coming into their room at night. To stop a Moroi, then, and one must find who it actually is if it is a living being. Va sighed. I have been somewhat hard-pressed to stamp out that rumor. I do not want my parish turning on each other with such accusations. But they will not abandon their belief in the Moroi. They simply will decide if it is a living being. I don't know. I was starting to sober up, which was depressing. Excuse me, I don't follow. I was starting to sober up, which was depressing. Father Sebastian shrugged helplessly. If she is not living, then she must be dead. Those are widely considered to be worse because you can block up the entrance that a live Moroi enters through, but if she is a ghost, she comes by way of your dreams, and how can you block the entrance to a dream? You can't, of course. There are dreams that I would wall off from myself if I could. I poured myself out a healthy measure of water. Is that what they think happened to Caudron? A ghost came into his dreams? Father Sebastian sighed. Toward the end, as he was dying, he started to hallucinate. You understand? It takes people that way sometimes, said Angus gruffly. The priest blinked, and I actually saw the moment that Va remembered that Angus and I were soldiers. Yes, of course. You would know. Va took a long swig of wine. He was raving about the Moroi sitting on his chest, taking his breath. And unfortunately, there are those who sit up with the dying who... Well, let us say the story spread, and not as the imaginings of a dying man. I winced. I'm no stranger to death, sad to say. Mostly the fast kind at the end of a bullet or a mortar shell, but I've seen the slow kind often enough, as infection and wound and fever take its toll. Often enough, the dying saw things that weren't there. Sometimes it was the enemy coming for them. Usually it was their mothers, once or twice something more dramatic. There was no rhyme or reason to it, not really. The most fanciful soldier I ever served beside was coldly lucid until Conhart stopped. And Sergeant Melissa, who had less imagination than a sheep, took 2 days to die and raved about angels and devils and spinning wheels of fire throughout. To have someone spread tales of whatever Caudron ranted about in his final days seemed monstrously crass. What the dying say is between them and God. And now there's a rumor that this ghost is haunting people's dreams? Asked Miss Potter. So they say. She is supposed to come in the form of a moth or a beautiful woman, though I think perhaps that last is mixed up with the tales of women who come at night to steal a man's... The priest suddenly remembered Miss Potter and coughed. Angus leaned forward and poured Va more wine, while we all pretended that Va hadn't been talking about wet dreams. Not something I experienced personally, you understand, but you don't live among soldiers who have their own slimy earth tongues popping up occasionally without getting a pretty good notion. At any rate, Va said, picking up the thread again, the dead Moroi are supposed to be the spirits of those buried in unconsecrated ground, without proper rites trying to steal enough breath that they can live again. Sometimes it is even said that the Moroi is the ghost of an unbaptized child or one stillborn, still trying to draw its first breath. Va sat up straighter. That, of course, is pure nonsense. God is merciful and would never punish an infant so. But surely this is all nonsense, said Miss Potter. You can't tell me that you believe this base superstition. Father Sebastian raised our eyebrows, then smiled suddenly. Do I believe that Moroi are a real thing lurking about and sitting on people's chests at night? No, of course not. But as soon as the story went around the village, I had a dozen people telling me they dreamed of the Moroi. The power of suggestion, as the mesmerists... Ooh, that's a new one too. Mesmerists, yes, as the mesmerists call it. But I cannot tell them that they're being silly. I can only tell them to trust in the Lord. Ba gazed into our wine glass. I've learned not to fight local superstitions. When I was barely out of seminary, I was assigned to a parish well south of here. They believe that the first day of the year that a shepherd led their flocks to the pasture, they must go completely... Va glanced at Miss Potter and clearly changed what Va was about to say. Unclothed. Otherwise, sickness would follow the flock and kill many of them. Miss Potter turned very slightly pink. Angus nodded to the priest and said, Aye, they used to do that in my village as well. It does not surprise me. Well, obviously, I tried to put a stop to it. It was indecent, and men and women both did it. Furthermore, it was generally still extremely cold, and they wouldn't even wear boots. One fellow was 70 years old, leading his sheep about, naked as the day he was born. It was only a matter of time before he caught his death. I'm guessing they didn't take kindly to that, said Angus, who was definitely smirking, but managed to keep it all behind his mustache. Father Bastion nodded ruefully. I thought I was making progress, but the bishop came down on my head and told me that I was of no account to interfere, or else the death of the sheep would be on my head. Turned out that he was also from a town where that was practiced. I've since learned to pick my battles. Ba drained our wine glass. Angus opened his mouth to say something, but stopped mid-word. A white moth had found one of the candles and was circling it, pale wings beating perilously close to the flame. All four of us watched it, torn between embarrassment and alarm. Shoo, I said, waving my hand at it. The candle flame bent in response. Wings kissed the back of my hand with a hint of moth dust, and then it fluttered away into the darkness of the rafters. Well, this has all been fascinating, Father, said Miss Potter, breaking the uncomfortable silence. I had no idea that local traditions were so... fraught. She smiled faintly. In England, all we had were druids. And fairies, of course. Angus didn't wince when she said fairies aloud, but he stilled just a little, as if hearing someone cock a gun in the distance. We've got those here, too, I said. Not the druids. I found myself reluctant to speak the word either. In Gallacia, we call them other families. They're supposed to lead people astray in the woods and whatnot. Miss Potter looked around the table as if she was waiting for one of us to start laughing. When no one did, she said, Speaking of going astray in the woods, said Father Sebastian, getting up, I should be heading back before it gets too dark to see my hand in front of my face. You're welcome to stay here, I said. Was there a shade of hesitation in our voice? It's very kind of you to offer, the priest said, but I really should be getting home. That night I dreamed of the Moroi. It began with two pale white threads snagged in a crack in my bedroom door. I lay in bed, watching them move restlessly as if questing for something. Then a wiggle, a sideways motion, and a large moth pressed itself through the crack. The moth fluttered through my bedroom, circling. Passed through the rack of antlers that hung above my head, lit for an instant in the sharp tip of one, then took flight again. It was a silvery gray shading to brown on its wings, the color of dried Galatian clay. I saw a flash of flesh-colored stripes along its abdomen, and then it landed on my bed and became a woman. She crouched on hands and knees beside me, looking down. Her skin was very pale and her eyelids had been painted dark colors. She was neither beautiful nor ugly. In fact, she was plain and almost forgettable looking. Round face, snub nose, heavy eyelids. Some part of me found that extremely odd. If a moth is going to take the trouble to turn into a woman, you would expect her to look either hideous or inhumanly beautiful, not like any one of 100 women that one might see on the streets of the capital. I felt slow and stuporous with sleep, but I struggled to say anything, and finally came out with, Pardon, mademoiselle, but I don't believe we've been introduced. She smiled slightly, or perhaps she had been smiling all along. Her lips were curved, though her eyes were sad. Basic chivalry compared me to ask, Is something wrong? She tilted her head, still with that small, sad smile, and leaned closer, almost within kissing distance. While I've occasionally kissed women that I haven't been introduced to, I do like to at least know their names if I'm in bed with them. There was a slim possibility that I had known it and had just forgotten, but it seemed unlikely. I don't actually go to bed with many strangers. I drew breath to ask her name again, and it didn't happen. Drawing breath, I mean. There was a weight pressing me down, and I realized that she was kneeling on my chest. I hadn't felt it happen, but now she was heavy, extremely heavy, and I could only get tiny sips of air. I tried to reach for her, but my arms were pinned beneath the blankets. She watched me sadly. Clearly, she had no idea she was crushing me. The dark room began to go darker, going silvery at the edge. If I faint, we are both going to be embarrassed. My tinnitus surged up then, ringing in my head like gunmetal bells. I winced, but it only rang louder, rising to that familiar tooth-aching whine, and suddenly I took a great gasping breath and sat bolt upright in bed. It took a moment to catch my breath. The tinnitus slowly receded. I was in my bed, alone, with the sheets knotted around me and a pounding headache that could easily be explained by the liver. That's chapter 6. Yeah, these chapters are going pretty quick. We're eating these up. So let's see how far we get tonight. I don't know about 80 pages, but we'll see. We'll see how far we get tonight. Chapter 7. The problem with telling the story, of course, is that you already know that I'm telling you about something significant that happened. It's not as if we sat down together and you said, "Alex, tell me a tale where you had a pleasant trip to your homeland and the worst menace you faced was the amount of paprika the widow put in the sausages." No, you wanted a proper hair raiser, and here I am trying to tell you one, whoever you are. So of course when you read me dreaming about the Moroi, it seemed insignificant. It seemed significant. God damn, I'm starting over. Hold on. Chapter 7. The problem with telling the story, of course, is that you already know that I'm telling you about something significant. It's not as if we sat down together and you said, "Alex, tell me a tale where you had a pleasant trip to your homeland and the worst menace you faced was the amount of paprika the widow put in sausages." No, you wanted a proper hair raiser, and here I am trying to tell you one, whoever you are. So of course, when you read me dreaming about the Moroi, it seemed significant. Doubtless, I seemed like a proper fool for not immediately packing up and going back to Paris. You can turn the page and assure yourself that you would be much wiser in my situation. Quite possibly you would be. Never claimed to be the sharpest tooth in the wolf's mouth. But for me, at the time, it was just a dream I had after heavy drinking and talking about a dream monster. The power of suggestion, as Father Sebastian had said. I got up and went downstairs, and the widow grumbled about young wastrels who slept until all hours, and I genuinely thought no more about it for quite some time. We settled into a routine quickly enough. Miss Potter would go out early looking for mushrooms, with Angus accompanying her to fend off wolves, bears, and nefarious mushroom thieves. I would sleep until a decadent hour, get up, endure the widow's comments on how it was all right for some, and engage in some general puttering around the lodge until Angus and Miss Potter returned for lunch, smiling and with flushed cheeks. I assumed this was from the late autumn chill. Certainly there was no other reason that they might be flushed. After all, we were all carefully observing propriety. Boars would stop work for an hour when the sun was high, to avoid the attentions of the Noon Witch. Do you have the Noon Witch in your country? She might be endemic to our region. She looks like a girl dressed in white, and she carries a scythe. If she talks to you while you are working, you must never try to change the subject, or she will strike off your head with it, or give you heat stroke. I've never heard of her appearing in winter, as she's a demon of sunstroke, but obviously it was better to be safe than sorry. Boars and I would play chess for an hour. I never won a game, but at least he had to work to beat me. In the afternoons, Miss Potter would retire for a nap, and Angus and I would sit around in comfortable silence reading whatever 2-week-old paper he had managed to acquire in the village. I would take Hob out for a gallop if the weather allowed, and then we would have a pleasant meal, during which Miss Potter regaled us with her finds for the day. Heavily annotated, of course, for my delicate antifungal sensibilities. She found her slimy earth tongue, which I was assured were harmless, if inedible, and I was treated to a discussion of the importance of the wax-capped meadow environment. In the evening, we would play cards, and Boris was willing to make a fourth for whist. Provided that there was no actual gambling. And while he took a long time to make his place, he was absolutely cutthroat once he did. It was like being bludgeoned to death by a cheerful turtle. With a routine in place, my nerves began to settle. Even the occasional wall of silence was easy enough to shrug off. I went days without jumping at shadows, and my dreams were no more frightening than ever. This pleasant state of affairs went on for about a week, and suddenly it didn't. It was a wet, muddy morning when I came upon Boris splitting firewood in the yard. He hadn't come in to play chess the last few days, and I had been wondering if I'd offended him. He seemed to be moving slower than normal, and as I watched, he placed a section of the stump, lifted the axe, swung, and missed. The blade struck badly off center, skidded down, and buried itself in the dirt along his foot, nearly kissing the boot leather. A half-inch more, and he would have been short several toes. "Horse!" I yelled. He jerked back in surprise, lifting the axe and very nearly putting it in his own shin with the weight of the head dragging it down. I grabbed the handle and took it away from him. "Boris, are you all right?" He turned to face me, and I took an involuntary step back, still clutching the axe between us. Boris was not all right. His eyes were huge and dark, and his face was drawn and waxy. The only color came from the circle under his eyes, which were bruised turquoise and violet with exhaustion. He looked more like a skull wearing makeup than a living man. "Boris?" "Sorry, Easton, sir," he mumbled, wiping at his forehead. "I haven't been sleeping well." "You look terrible." I set the axe down. "Sorry, sir." "That's not, I don't mean..." I flailed my hands. You need to rest. You're in no state to swing an axe around." He peered vaguely around the stable yard. If it had been anyone else, I'd have thought he was nursing the hangover of a lifetime, but as far as I knew, the only alcohol that Boris had ever drunk was given to him by a priest, along with a very thin wafer and some Latin. "Not done working," he said. "You're done for the day. Go to bed." I tried to turn him toward the stable, but he resisted. "Can't. Need to finish work." He swallowed. "Need to earn the wages." "Hang the wages," I almost said, but bit it back. Easy for me to say, who was paying said wages after all. Instead, I said, "You've done the work of 2 men already this week. You've earned your wages clear through Sunday. Now go get some rest. That's your job for the rest of the day." Excuse me 1 second, I'm getting a call. Please bear with me. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. His grandmother would have argued out of sheer pride, but Boris was either made of less stubborn stuff or simply didn't have the energy to fight. He stumbled off toward the stable, and I followed far enough to make certain that he actually went into his room there, then went to tell the widow. She muttered something about young men shirking work, but her heart clearly wasn't in it, given how quickly she shucked off her apron and went to check on him. "How's Boris?" I asked the widow the next morning as she transferred sausage from the frying pan to the plate. "He's keeping," which, as I have already pointed out, could mean anything from a full recovery to being measured for a coffin. "Yes, but is he feeling better, or..." "He's keeping well enough," she said, adding more words without any more information. He pushed the plate toward me. "Eat. I'll not be making you another breakfast if you let this one get cold." I took my plate, bolted my breakfast, and decided to go check on the patient myself. The door to his room was ajar. Oddly enough, someone had shoved a handkerchief into the keyhole. I was staring at it, hanging there like a little white flag of surrender, when I heard a gasping moan from inside. "Boris, are you all right?" I peered around the doorframe and saw him, a humped shape under the blankets. His breathing was labored and painful, as if a corner of the blanket had gotten into his mouth. I didn't want to go and shake him, though. That seemed rather aggressive intimacy. I tried raising my voice. "Boris!" He sat up and sucked in his breath in a harsh gasp, then broke into a coughing fit. I stepped into the room and... pulled 2 pages. Started pounding him on the back. "Steady on, old fellow. Something go down the wrong pipe?" "Sorry, sir," he mumbled. "Time for work?" He shook his head and coughed again. "I'm sorry, I'm just so tired." "No work for you today," I said with false heartiness. He looked dreadful. seen dead men with better color. You just focus on getting better. I'll send your grandmother in with some tea and breakfast, shall I? Yes, sir. He sank back to the mattress, looking around the room in bleary confusion. I still wasn't certain if waking him up was the right thing to do or not, but I hadn't liked the way his breathing sounded. It put me in mind of my own dream the other night when I had awoken unable to catch my breath. But no, that had gone away in a moment or two. Nothing like this. I shook off the thought and told myself sternly that Bors was the one who was ill and that I was much too old to be making such things all about myself. At least Bors was breathing easier now. I went inside to fetch the widow. And you may call me a fool if you'd like, because even then I didn't think of Codron. Chapter 8. Bors was no better the next day. I found him asleep, sitting upright next to the spring house with a bucket in his lap. When I woke him, he jumped, shocked, and looked at me with dark, circled eyes. Oh, sir, I'm sorry, I just sat down for a moment. Bors, I said sternly, taking the bucket. You should be very sorry. I definitely did not give you permission to go back to work. It's freezing out here. Come on, lean on me. Let's get you back down the hill. He protested weakly, but he was in no shape to stop me from taking that bucket. He wasn't feverish, at least, that I could tell from supporting him on the way back. Since sleeping seemed like... seemed to be anathema. That's a new one for me. Or perhaps he was simply bored to tears. I saw him tucked up in the lodge, near the fire with a couple of bridles. Here, I said. Check these over and mend any worn spots. I'll get oil on the blanket, he mumbled. Then I shall fetch you a saddle blanket, which I did. Then I made tea, because even if I couldn't have hot tea on hand every minute of the day like Codron had, I could still boil up something. Codron had been alone in the house when his lungs had begun to fail him. What must that have been like? He and Bors were cut from the same uncomplaining cloth. I could all too easily imagine him trying to work as Bors was, without anyone on hand to tell him to sit down and rest, goddammit. My thoughts circled Codron as I waited for the kettle to heat up. Had he been frightened? Had he suspected that he was dying? Could Bors be? Not on my watch, I thought grimly. Found the widow in the pantry, measuring out a cup of salt, and said, with my usual delicacy intact, I think we should fetch a doctor for Bors. A doctor? The widow looked at me as if I'd suggested sending for the hangman. Do you want him to die? That's the exact opposite of what I want. She sniffed and pushed past me, still carrying the salt. Doctor. Might as well put him in the ground and save the money. That bit I understood. I rubbed the back of my neck. Mrs. Botazato, I'd be more than happy to pay for it. Can you believe this, Lord? He asked the ceiling. Young wastrels offering to pay doctors. Might as well hire an assassin as well, you know. Mrs. Botazato picked up a carving knife. Fortunately, the kettle went off at that moment, and she took over making tea before I could find just what she was planning to use the knife for, or what strange recipe required an entire heaping cup of salt. It was a long day, made longer by worrying. I've seen too many people take ill, and too many of those people didn't recover. I told myself that most of those people had been shot and picked up an infection afterward, which was totally different than whatever was troubling Bors. Then I told myself that this was absolutely nothing like what happened to my old friend Madeline Usher. There was not even a trace of catalepsy involved, and it was ridiculous to even think of such things. Then I drank too much, although I retained enough decency to wait until after dinner so as to not embarrass myself in front of Miss Potter. When I finally made my way to bed, I sank into the mattress, shoved my arm under the pillow, and promptly let out a bellow as something stabbed me. Angus was in the doorway, his pistol at the ready, by the time I got the lamp lit. My knuckles were leaking blood and my nightshirt was splattered with red, but there was no one else in the room. Why in the name of St. Elias's blighted left nut, I snarled, was there a knife under my pillow? There's nothing quite like being stabbed to sober one up quickly. Angus looked at the knife. It was the sword you'd used to cut fruit. It had carved quite a nice divot out from in between my first and second knuckles. Miss Potter appeared behind Angus. Easton? He asked groggily. What's going on? My duty as a host rose up and strangled my outrage. Forgive me, Miss Potter, I said, bleeding with as much dignity as I could muster. I did not mean to wake you. I closed my eyes briefly, struck by a sudden dreadful suspicion. Is there, by chance, any cutlery under your pillow? Cutlery, said Miss Potter. I'm afraid so. In Miss Potter, the legendary stiff upper lip of the British was cast in steel. She nodded as if this were a perfectly normal request, returned to her room, and reappeared a moment later holding a very large butcher's knife. Her expression wavered between this is arguably somewhat peculiar and, of course, all the best people keep knives in the bed. At the moment, peculiar was winning, but only just. Angus muttered something under his mustache and went to his own room. He came out holding a bread knife. Under the pillow, he confirmed. There was only one possible culprit, of course. The widow did this, I said. The knife lay beside my pillow, with a bit of flesh clinging to it like the skin of a melon. But why are there knives under the pillows? Asked Miss Potter. That is an excellent question, I said through my teeth. It's an old superstition, said Angus. Iron under your pillow wards off evil. Ah, said Miss Potter. But what was she... I clamped my mouth shut on the next words. I did not want to know what evil the widow feared, and what I wanted was to go downstairs, rouse the widow, and give her the sort of dressing down that the enlisted would speak of in hushed voices for years to come, which would accomplish exactly nothing. I could hardly threaten to bust her back down to private, and I would have felt monstrous firing the widow Butzatu. She obviously needed the wage, as did Boars. They were poor as church mice, but the widow could take charity when hell froze over and the dead sang hosannas at the second coming. Right, I said. Suppose we'll just go back to bed then, shall we? I apologize for having woken you all. I appreciate the warning, said Miss Potter, graciously gazing at her knife. I noticed absently that the widow had given her biggest knife in the kitchen. Obviously, Miss Potter warranted the very best. Let's wrap up that hand first, said Angus. I submitted to this with less than perfect grace, but of course it's very hard to bandage your own hand. I washed it in the basin, which hurt more than the initial stabbing. Then Angus wrapped it in a couple layers of bandage. I stared upward, which is how I noticed that the rack of antlers now bore a cat's cradle of red thread. I realized that I could not possibly deal with that in my current state and transferred my gaze to the wall. She meant well, said Angus, when he had tucked the ends under. She's worried. About what? I snapped. Moroi or werewolves or whatever it was. Can't say that. Werewolves. The wire knife could be... Hey, I know about the iron thing, the iron warding off evil. That is correct. I'm just curious if irons in that day, if knives in that day were made of iron, but I guess everything kind of was, wasn't it? I don't know about iron spoons, though. If they had spoons, they were likely made of wood or something cheaper. He is an aristocrat, though, but it is a hunting cabin. It's not his, main, residence. Anyway, off topic. His matter-of-fact answer brought me up short. My eyes drifted to the red thread above me. But that's nonsense. You know it's just superstition. Witch hairs are just superstition, too. I recoil as if I had just been slapped. In Moravia, Legends of Witch Hairs, what we'd found when we opened up a dead one had been far worse. I'm not saying what it was or wasn't, said Angus, getting to his feet. I'm saying that the widow isn't a fool and she's worried, which makes me worried. He didn't add, and you ought to be worried too. He didn't have to. I stared up at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the silence and wondering if I was a fool. I woke much too early in the morning and discovered that it was beginning to snow. I thought for a minute that this meant the end of our sojourn in Gallacia. I might have rejoiced, but alas, it was the kind of snow that you get around here in autumn. Where it falls as flakes, hits warm ground, and melts immediately. We could still have several weeks left before the ground actually froze, which meant that there would be plenty of time yet for mushrooms. Anyway, if I turned tail and ran for Paris, Boars would still be here without a doctor. Probably he'd recover just fine, of course. Likely it was only a cold. There was no reason to feel responsible except that I had money for a doctor and the widow didn't, and god damn it, what if I could fix this? There were also so few things in the world that I can fix. One of those things may or may not be knives under pillows at night. Moroi. I had spent half the night arguing with myself about whether or not such things could exist. In the gritty light of dawn, it all seemed ridiculous. Women who turned into malls to haunt your dreams? I wonder Miriam had slammed the door on me as if she'd been hearing people spout such nonsense since her father's death. I entered the kitchen and found the widow engaged in the alchemy that turns large bones into delicious stock. I understand how it all works, but it didn't look rather as if she were throwing, but it did look rather as if she were throwing the remains of some unfortunate soul into a stew pot. Nevertheless, Mrs. Botazatu, I said with wonderful calm, did you know that there were knives under our pillows last night? Put them there yesterday, she said, as if this should be blindingly obvious. I'm afraid I stabbed myself. She stopped, turned, and stuck out her hand. I stared at that hand, not sure what I was supposed to do, and she snapped her fingers and wriggled them impatiently. I eventually realized that I was supposed to show her my injury. She said, when she could not find immediate fault with Angus's doctoring. Now surely you must see that there's no reason to put... I'll mix up some honey and onion, he said, ignoring my attempts at firmness. Honey and onion is an old Galatian cure-all for external injuries. For internal injuries, remove the onion and add liver instead. Really, there's no need. And I'll need those knives back for cooking, mind. You can have them tonight. I'm not sure if I... An hour later, Angus found me lurking in the stable. Hob had gotten some tangles in his mane and I was brushing them out, trying not to make any noise that might disturb boars. He was still dead to the world, and I was inclined to let the poor man sleep. What happened to you? He whispered. What is that smell? The widow happened. Ah, he craned his neck past me. Boar still asleep? I certainly hope so. I fancied I could hear the rattle of his breath from here. I wish the widow would let me send for a doctor, but whenever I suggest it, she acts like I want to take boars out behind the barn and shoot them. Ah, well, you know how some people are. They don't send for the doctor until it's far too late for one to help, and so of course doctors must be useless and just hasten the dying. My own family was the same way. Angus, I said. You're the same way. I practically had to sit on you that time you broke your ribs. Kept saying you'd walk it off. And what good did the doctor do me? I already knew wrapping it and had a good goose grease plaster to draw out the pain. He gave you pills for the pain, and the apartment smelled like mustard and dead goose for a month. Angus's mustache appeared unconvinced, but he changed the subject. At any rate, we were talking about the widow, not me. Have you considered sending for the priest? Might be that Va could convince her. This struck me as a marvelously sensible plan. In fact, I was lucky. Va might put the widow's mind at ease about Moroi. And Angus's mind. Possibly my mind as well. I combed the last tangle from Hobbs' mane and picked the stray hairs from the brush. That reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it. I stared at the long, silky hairs and stood on my bandaged hand and thought of knives and honey and onions. Father Sebastian is a brilliant idea. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Angus began saddling the horses. I slipped into the room at the end of the stable and found Boars propped up on pillows, looking like lukewarm death. Boars? He looked at me blearily. How are you feeling? And don't say I'm keeping. He managed a wan smile. Like there's something heavy. He sucked in a shallow, rattling breath. On my chest. The hag that sits on your chest. I scowled at the thought, and Boris gave me a worried look. Is there something that needs doing? He struggled to sit farther up. No, not at all. We were thinking of going into town. Do you need anything? He shook his head. I wondered if there was a knife under his pillow. Given how the widow had been acting, I wouldn't be surprised if there was an entire armory. Right, I said. I'm going to try to get a doctor for you. Don't tell your grandmother. Boris nodded. I turned to go, but his next word stopped me. Grandmother says I have to fight her, but I'm no good at fighting. Never was. Fight her? Fight who? He closed his eyes, losing the battle of sleep. That woman in my dreams. And that's chapter 8. And these are flying by, my God. But that did bring us to the hour mark. That brought us to the hour mark. That's right on time. We're right on time. I think there's enough here for one more session. What we're gonna do, yeah, we're gonna save chapters 9 through 14 for our. We're gonna have a little big finale night. We're gonna do some, maybe a little bit early in the day, maybe a 6 or 7 o'clock on Sunday here this week. Tomorrow is going to be Adventure Day. I want to read an adventure book. I just feel like the change of pace would be good. Then we'll hop right into the big finale for this book. I am already trying to look. I'm already looking for the third book in the series. There is one more left in the trilogy, and it still follows our hero Alex Easton. So we'll see what that has to come. I heard it takes place in America. I think I read a little excerpt that it was taking place in America. So we might be visiting an old friend. Who woofed me? Might be visiting an old friend here soon. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep these all in an hour. I had a goal in mind. But yeah, that'll do for tonight. I thank you guys so much for stopping by. Good night. I love you.